I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother with me again in the rest of my life, I ain't giving them paycheck. I can't. There's good friends of mine on the pay. Well, he's the boss. You have to do what he tells you.
You see, that's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the boss to me is that the boss is your boss. You understand?
Angelo Ruggiero, a riveting puzzle etched into the chronicles of organized crime, wielded a mesmerizing blend of intellectual prowess and unswerving loyalty, a symphony that reverberated through the darkest corridors of the underworld. Emerging from the gritty heart of Brooklyn, his sphere of influence spanned the ethereal glow of clandestine clubs to the commanding heights of power. Yet, concealed within the labyrinthine weave of covert wiretaps lay the explosive revelation of his central role in the dramatic downfall of John Gotti, the legendary overlord of the Gambino crime family, shattering the once-impregnable aura of invincibility that enshrouded him. Ruggiero's legacy, an intricately spun tapestry of fascination, forever rewrote the script of criminal history. Angelo Ruggiero's father was a first-generation immigrant from Naples, Italy who was not involved in organized crime. Ruggiero's mother was Emma Camposano. Angelo's brothers were Gambino associate Salvatore Ruggiero Sr., John Ruggiero, and Francis Little Frankie Ruggiero. Angelo was born on July 29, 1940, in Brooklyn and raised in the East New York section of Brooklyn. Angelo met John Gotti when the Gottis moved to East New York from Sheepshead Bay. At the time they were both 12-year-olds. At the age of 16, John left school and joined his brother Peter in the Fulton Rockaway Boys gang, named after an intersection that crisscrossed their turf. Unlike most teenage gangs of the era, the boys were concerned about more than their turf. They stole cars, dealt in stolen merchandise, ripped off stores and mugged drunks stumbling out of betting parlors. John flourished in the gang and was soon a leader. The biggest differences between John and the other gang members, however, were his violent temper and his overbearing attitude, which caused boys of weaker disposition to fall into line. Angelo, like John, had a violent temper, dropped out of school, and shared similar ambitions. Angelo was nicknamed Quack-Quack by other gang members, partly because of his odd, duck-like walk, but mostly because his constant chatter reminded them of an agitated duck clacking its bill. He was never quiet, and he seemed compelled to say something. John would occasionally say, "For Christ's sake, Ange, don't you ever stop talking," and Angelo would just respond saying no and carry on chattering. Richard, a brother of John, also became a part of the gang. As they grew older, Angelo started calling John almost every morning, eventually forming a relationship with him similar to that of an appointment secretary. Wilfred Johnson, an amateur boxer whom they dubbed Willie Boy, also joined the gang. Michael, Mickey Boy, Paradiso and Anthony Diorino, an apprentice plumber, were among the others to join the gang. By 1966, John was a full-fledged but hardly prosperous associate of an East New York crew under Carmine Futico, who moved his storefront headquarters to a working-class neighborhood in Queens known as Ozone Park. By then John and his crew, which included Angelo, began making a living as hijackers. Soon John's younger brother Gene and Angelo's older brother Salvatore joined the gang. Another pair of brothers who hung out in the neighborhood, John and Charles Carneglia, also joined. Angelo, John and Gene picked up their first hijacking charge in 1968. Impersonating truckers, they drove a rented U-Haul truck right into an airport cargo area and loaded it up with women's dresses. Unfortunately for them, the FBI had mounted one of its occasional crackdowns on airport thefts, and agents were watching the whole thing. While on bail, they were involved in the hijacking of 2 trucks on the New Jersey Turnpike. John, operating on a telephone from his bar in Queens, was trying to get the trucks back to a drop in a warehouse near the bar. However, the police had a wiretap on it and were in place waiting. While John was screaming in rage and frustration, the men in the second truck were unable to get it in gear or start. The police found the second truck with one of the hijackers still kicking the engine. Police arrested 10 members of the crew, which included Angelo Ruggiero, John Carneglia, and John and Jean Gotti. John and Angelo were in prison for nearly 3 years. However, prosecutors abandoned the second federal case after a judge ruled that some evidence was illegally obtained. A new state wiretap law had been declared unconstitutional and recordings from the bar telephone were useless as evidence. Their lawyer, Michael Coiro, sweet-talked a judge in a Queens courthouse into a deal permitting them to plead guilty and to regard their time in Lewisburg as the penalty. Coiro, recommended by Carmine Futico, would become closer to John and Angelo than a lawyer ever should. When they got out of prison, with Neil Della Croce, the underboss of the Gambino crime family's endorsement, Futico designated John as acting capo until his legal problems were resolved. This meant John now had to report regularly to Della Croce at the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy. John introduced Angelo and Jean to Della Croce, who now supplanted Futico as John's mentor. A huge opportunity came for Gotti and his crew in early 1973 when they carried out a high-priority assignment. A nephew of the Gambinos named Emmanuel Gambino had been abducted and murdered, despite the payment of $100,000 ransom. The Gambinos fingered a stick-up man and small-time criminal by the name of James McBratney as the kidnapper's ringleader, and Carlo Gambino wanted revenge. On May 22, 1973, 3 men impersonating detectives accosted McBratney in Snoop's Bar and Grill in Staten Island. After a brief struggle, they fatally shot him. 2 months later, 2 witnesses picked 2 of the killers out of a police photo array. One was Angelo Ruggiero and the other was Ralph Gallione. In July 1973, Angelo and Ralph Gallione were arrested and charged for the murder of McBratney. In December 1973, Gallione was shot to death in the hall of the apartment building where he lived in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn. The NYPD had no idea who the third accomplice in the murder of McBratney was. However, with help from Willie Boy Johnson, who had become a secret informant, they knew who it was. Willie Boy had begun talking 7 years earlier, after Futico reneged on a promise to help Willie Boy's wife and children when he had to go away to prison for a few months. He also knew he would never become a made man because he was part Indian on his father's side. John eluded cops for nearly a year, until the spring of 1974, when Willie Boy gave the FBI another tip, who passed it on to the NYPD. It's worth noting that according to the book Mob Star, by G. Mustaine and Jerry Capecci, James McBratney was not a part of the Gambino kidnap scheme. Both Angelo and John pleaded guilty to attempted manslaughter and were sentenced in August 1975 to 4 years, of which they only served 2. Before Carlo Gambino died on October 15, 1976, he named Paul Castellano as Gambino family boss with Della Croce remaining as underboss. In 1977, John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero as well as John Carneglia were initiated as made men in the Gambino crime family, shortly after the 2 got out of state prison. Angelo, already married, moved his family into Howard Beach. Angelo's brother Salvatore was now a millionaire thanks to heroin but also a fugitive, to avoid arrest in a tax case related to his dealing. While in the wind, he had continued to deal, and some of his money was hidden in companies controlled by their mutual plumber friend from childhood, Anthony Guarino. However, he stayed in contact with John and Angelo. In 1981, William Batista, a John Gotti associate who also became an informant, became suspicious when a Bergen regular told him that Gotti and Angelo always had rolls of quarters on them because they were talking with Angelo's fugitive brother, Salvatore, the heroin dealer, from a never-ending series of pay phones. Then Batista noticed Mark Ryder, a well-known heroin dealer with ties to the Harlem heroin market, at the Bergen for closed-door meetings with Gotti and Angelo. Salvatore Ruggiero once snuck into town under the guise of Stephen Terry for a covert meeting with Gotti and Angelo. The evidence mounted even as Gotti continued to warn crew associates that they played with fire if they dealt drugs. Despite his posturing, Gotti never punished anyone who dealt drugs. Batista's heroin-dealing suspicions arose as the FBI and the Justice Department laid plans for a major crackdown on Cosa Nostra. Late in 1981, a 13-member squad of agents in New York, known as the Gambino Squad, launched an electronic assault against Angelo Ruggiero. Because Angelo told Willie Boy that his home telephone in Howard Beach was safe, they knew he was probably using it to discuss illegal business. The Gambino Squad learned how a degenerate gambler John had become. This was actually after John's youngest son, 12-year-old Frank Gotti, was run over and killed on a family friend's minibike by a neighbor named John Favara on March 18, 1980. The agents also increased physical surveillance of Angelo, and sometimes they let Angelo know they were around, to see what discussion it might provoke on the wiretaps and bugs. With Angelo's phones tapped and his house bugged, the FBI investigation gathered steam. Agents overheard Angelo's daughter saying a mark had left a package. Agents in Florida learned that a Salvatore Ruggiero courier had departed for New York with 13 kilos of heroin. New Jersey agents surveilled Angelo and John Carneglia as the pair met with two dealers from Canada. In New York, Gambino Squad agents overheard Gene Gotti tell Angelo the only reason the Castellano was against drugs was that he never had to struggle for a quarter in his life. After two soldiers accused another of dealing heroin, Castellano summoned John Gotti to Staten Island in April 1982. He gave John the contract to kill Peter, Little Pete, Tambone. Della Croce spoke to Castellano and persuaded him to put Tambone's fate up to the Commission, the Cosa Nostra Board of Directors. This ended in a deadlock and Little Pete was allowed to live. Angelo gave the news to Little Pete, and the penalty that would be imposed instead. He could not engage in family business for 6 months. He would have to apologize to Paul and pretend he never handled any heroin. On May 6, 1982, Salvatore Ruggiero, who had been hiding out for 6 years in Florida, hired a private plane with his wife and 2 pilots and were killed when the plane crashed. Michael Coiro, Angelo and John's trusted lawyer, came up from semi-retirement in Florida to help Angelo sort out the complicated tangle of his brother's assets. At Angelo's bugged house, Coiro told Frank DeChico that Gene found the heroin in Salvatore's hideout. Coiro stayed in New York for several weeks to help Angelo out, but he also dug himself a grave, because while Angelo was trying to untangle his brother's hidden interests in property and companies, he was also trying to sell Salvatore's heroin. For several more months, the bugs in Angelo's house picked up dozens of highly incriminating conversations. In August 1983, Angelo, Gene, John Carneglia, Mark Ryder, Michael Coiro, and several more go-betweens and errand boys were arrested and accused of dealing multiple kilos of heroin. Willie Boy, who was involved, skated free. Batista, unaware that Willie Boy also was a double agent, told the FBI he was surprised that Willie Boy was not arrested. Angelo, Gene, and John Carneglia, the key men under the Della Croce wing, were seen as an assault on Paul Castellano's credibility, and this foreshadowed a showdown. FBI and other law enforcement agencies sharply began to target the Cosa Nostra bosses under the new racketeering law that made bosses as vulnerable to prosecution, known as RICO. Castellano especially would feel the pressure. He would be indicted twice and warned that a third case was on the way. Paul instantly knew that he could not just eliminate core members of John Gotti's crew without an aggressive response. Della Croce managed to get Castellano to delay a reaction to Angelo's situation until Castellano was able to personally review the tapes. Castellano then told John Gotti to turn over the tapes to him, once prosecutors turned them over to defense lawyers. Several delays in the pre-trial stages of the case delayed the government's production of the tapes and played into Della Croce's strategy. Early in 1984, Castellano faced more serious problems: the investigation of Roy DeMeo. Castellano's troubles got worse. Remarks captured on the bugs at Angelo's house established probable cause for law enforcement to place bugs in his mansion as well, and that bug had recorded many damaging conversations between Castellano and others in the last year. By the summer of 1984, Castellano was still demanding for copies of the tapes, and Della Croce had been stricken by cancer and was undergoing chemotherapy, but still managed to run interference with Castellano. By 1985, John Gotti faced a federal RICO case as well, a case assembled by Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Giacalone, who grew up in Queens. In February 1985, the federal hammer raised by the Angelo bugs slammed down on the crime capital. In March 1985, Neil Della Croce, Armand Della Croce, and 8 others were indicted under the RICO law and accused of crimes ranging from murder to loan sharking. In the spring of 1985, Castellano's trial in the first of his cases was to begin. The dispute over Angelo's tapes was still unresolved, but a few excerpts had appeared in pre-trial legal papers submitted by prosecutors in Castellano's commission case, and these told him that the Gambino squad had also overheard Angelo talking about Peter Tambone and the commission, with unauthorized parties. Once again, Castellano asked for Angelo's tapes, but again, Della Croce encouraged delay. In June 1985, John and Angelo went to Della Croce to review Castellano's newly persistent demands for the heroin tapes. Bugs placed in Della Croce's house would record Angelo make up a story to explain his refusal to turn over transcripts of tapes made by the bugs in his house in 1982. Angelo told Sammy Gravano he had good reason to believe that once Della Croce dies, Castellano would try and whack him. John Gotti and Angelo told Della Croce the same thing. A bug placed in Della Croce's home recorded these conversations and showed Della Croce was weary of telling lies and looking for a way to end the crisis without bloodshed. He said to John and Angelo that he told Castellano Angelo cannot give the tapes because his family is on there. Della Croce told Angelo, "I've been trying to make you get away with these tapes, but Jesus Christ Almighty, I can't stop the guy from always bringing it up." On December 2, 1985, the day the Della Croce Gotti trial had been scheduled to start, Aniello Della Croce passed away. Castellano never showed up at Della Croce's wake. However, he summoned the capo regimes and announced that he was going to close the rave night and assign John Gotti and his soldiers in what he pointedly referred to as the Futico crew to other Decina. In other words, he was demoting Della Croce's protégé and eliminating the Bergen crew. To make matters worse, Castellano said there's a rumor out that Della Croce was a rat, referring to one of the newspapers that suggested that Della Croce was a longtime secret informant for the FBI. John Gotti flew into a rage, with Frank DeCicco and Tommy Gambino trying to calm him. What Castellano didn't know was that there was already a plot against him by John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, Joseph Armone, Frank DeCicco, and Robert DiBernardo. The plotters, given the Angelo tapes dispute, decided that Angelo should not be a major player. On Monday, December 16, 1985, Thomas Bellotti drove Paul Castellano to the pre-arranged early evening meeting at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan on East 46th Street near 3rd Avenue. As Castellano was exiting the car at the front of the restaurant at around 5:26 p.m., gunmen ran up and shot him several times. Bellotti was shot as he exited from the driver's door. Before leaving the murder scene, John Gotti drove over to view the bodies. After John Gotti became boss of the Gambino family, he made Frank DeCicco his underboss, Sammy Gravano was elevated to capo, and Angelo Ruggiero became the capo of his Bergen crew.